Welcome to Whispers of the Blood Moon, where the shadows speak and the darkness whispers your name. If you dare to journey with us into the depths of horror, click like and subscribe now. Let the blood moon guide you and join our circle of the haunted. But beware. Once you enter, there is no escape. The night awaits you. Will you answer its call?
The van's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the long, cracked road leading to Elwood Asylum. Inside, the team sat in tense silence, each person lost in their own thoughts as the building loomed closer. The air seemed to grow thicker the nearer they got, as if even the night was warning them to turn back. Jack Zagans kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. He'd been to plenty of places with dark histories, but something about Elwood Asylum felt different, as though the darkness here wasn't just in the past. It was alive, stretching out like a hand ready to pull them in. When the asylum finally came into view, its silhouette loomed against the night sky, a decaying monolith of brick and broken glass. The windows stared back at them like hollow eyes, and the structure's once white facade had been stained by years of neglect, streaked with dirt and creeping vines. Even from the safety of the van, it felt as if the building was watching them, waiting. Jack brought the vehicle to a stop, the engine rumbling into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The asylum seemed to press in on them from all sides. Jack took a deep breath and turned to the others. "All right, we stick together, stay sharp, and don't take any unnecessary risks," he said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at the back of his mind. "This place has a history. Let's make sure we don't become part of it." Clara, the team's sensitive, was the first to step out of the van. She gripped the silver pendant around her neck, her movements slow and deliberate. "There's something off about the energy here," she murmured. "It's heavy, like we're walking into a storm." "Sounds about right," Ethan replied as he began unloading the equipment. The tech specialist was already checking the cameras, audio recorders, and EMF detectors, his movements methodical. "Or maybe it's just the fact that we're about to spend the night in a place where people were tortured and experimented on," he added, a forced smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Sophie, the skeptic and documentarian, climbed out last, slinging her camera bag over her shoulder. "It's just another building," she said, though there was a tightness in her voice. "Let's get this done." Jack glanced at Harris, their historian, who was standing by the rusted metal doors, peering at the darkened windows above. "You've gone through the records? Anything we should be worried about?" Harris adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on the entrance, as if trying to pierce the darkness within. There were a lot of unexplained deaths, disappearances, and Dr. Harlan, the head doctor, was notorious for his treatments. "They weren't exactly humane," he said. "People said patients would go in for treatment and come out different, or not at all." A shiver ran down Jack's spine, though he kept his expression neutral. "Let's make sure we're not adding our names to that list," he said as he led the way toward the entrance. He reached for the door, pulling it open with a groan of metal and rust, the sound echoing into the emptiness beyond. Inside, the air was colder, with a stale, musty scent that seemed to cling to the walls. The flashlight beams revealed a long corridor lined with cracked tiles and broken light fixtures. Rusted gurneys and abandoned medical equipment lay scattered along the walls, covered in layers of dust and decay. Faded graffiti adorned the surfaces, the letters scrawled in jagged lines that seemed to scream out of the darkness. The others filed in behind him, their footsteps echoing in the silence. "This place is a maze," Sophie said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "We'll need to mark our path or we'll get lost." Ethan nodded, snapping a glow stick and tossing it to the floor. "I'll set up the cameras too," he said. "Motion sensors, night vision, we'll have everything covered. If there's something here, we'll catch it." "Good," Jack replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to see what the cameras might pick up. There was an unease settling over him, a feeling that they were already being watched. He took a deep breath and moved forward, leading the group deeper into the asylum's depths. The darkness seemed to thicken with every step, swallowing the beams of their flashlights. Each sound echoed too loudly, each creak and groan of the old building amplified until it felt like the asylum itself was breathing. Jack could feel the history of the place pressing down, a weight that seemed to cling to the air and seep into his skin. They hadn't even reached the heart of the asylum, but already it felt as though something was pulling them in. The further they walked, the more he felt it, a growing sense of anticipation, as though the asylum was aware of their presence and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Stay alert," Jack said, his voice cutting through the silence. The others nodded, their faces tense with focus. As they ventured deeper, the oppressive darkness seemed to swallow their words, leaving only the hollow echoes behind. Whatever was inside these walls, it had been waiting for a long time. The asylum's silence was thick, almost suffocating, as the P.I.G team moved deeper into the labyrinthine halls. Jack led the way, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, revealing glimpses of rusted metal doors and faded signs that pointed to abandoned wards and treatment rooms. The air grew colder the further they ventured, the musty scent of decay mingling with something else, something faintly chemical like old antiseptic. Ethan walked a few steps behind, setting up equipment along the way. He placed motion detectors at key intersections and positioned infrared cameras in rooms that seemed likely to be hotspots for activity. His hands moved quickly with a practiced ease, but there was a tightness in his expression that betrayed his discomfort. "I'm getting a lot of interference on the equipment," Ethan muttered, checking the feed on one of the cameras. "It's glitching more than usual. I've never seen the EMF readings spike like this in an empty building." Jack paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Could be the old wiring," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Or something else. Let's keep moving." Clara drifted further ahead, her fingers grazing the chipped tiles of the walls. She could feel it, a heaviness in the air, as if the asylum itself was exuding a kind of energy that seeped into her skin. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sensations wash over her. There was a sadness here, and something else lurking beneath it, something sharp, like the edge of a blade. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She opened her eyes and looked back at the others. "I can feel it. There's something here with us." "Great," Sophie said dryly, raising her camera to film a long stretch of corridor. "Well, let's see if it wants to make an appearance for the camera, shall we?" As they approached a set of heavy double doors marked Treatment Wing, the air seemed to grow even colder, and a low, distant sound echoed through the hall. It was a rhythmic creaking, like metal swaying back and forth. The group froze, their breath visible in the sudden chill. "Did anyone else hear that?" Harris asked, his voice tight. He had been at the rear, reviewing some of the historical documents he'd brought along, trying to match up the layout with old blueprints of the asylum. Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. It sounded like something swinging or moving. He stepped forward and pushed open one of the double doors, the hinges groaning loudly in protest. Beyond lay a long, dimly lit room, with several rusted gurneys lined up along the walls. The far end of the room disappeared into shadow, but the source of the noise was unmistakable now, an old light fixture hanging from the ceiling, swinging gently back and forth, as if it had just been disturbed. Clara's breath hitched as she stepped inside. "There's a lot of residual energy here," she said, her voice low. "It's like echoes. People were in a lot of pain in this room." Jack glanced at the gurneys, their metal surfaces pitted with rust and the leather straps stiff with age. This was where they conducted some of the more controversial treatments, wasn't it? He asked Harris, who had just entered the room behind them. Harris nodded grimly, flipping through his notes. Dr. Harlan's patients often underwent procedures here, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and worse. It wasn't just about curing them, it was about breaking them down. As if on cue, a faint shuffling sound came from the shadows at the back of the room. The team froze, turning their attention toward the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the rhythmic creaking of the light fixture. Then, a cold breeze seemed to sweep through the room, making the hair on Jack's arms stand on end. "Is there anyone here with us?" Clara asked, taking a step closer to the shadows. Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "If you can hear us, show us a sign." There was a pause, and then, faintly, the sound of whispering drifted through the air. It was indistinct, like many voices speaking at once, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he shone his flashlight into the shadows. But there was nothing visible, just the empty corners of the room, the dust dancing in the beam of light. Ethan was hunched over his equipment, his fingers flying across the buttons as he tried to adjust the settings. "I'm picking up something. Faint EMF spikes," he said. "But it's inconsistent, like it's coming and going." As the team stood there, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing, a sudden loud crash shattered the silence. One of the gurneys tipped over, slamming into the floor with a deafening clang that echoed down the halls. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and Sophie let out a startled gasp as she spun around, her camera trained on the fallen gurney. "Okay, that definitely wasn't just the wind," she said, her voice rising. Jack's pulse raced as he took a cautious step toward the overturned gurney. It lay on its side, the wheels still spinning. "We've got to be careful," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "If there's anything here, it knows we're here now too." Clara took a few slow steps back, her hand going to the silver pendant at her neck. "The energy, it's changing," she said. "It's not just echoes anymore. It's aware." Sophie kept her camera focused on the fallen gurney, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Well, if it wants to be seen, it's got our attention," she said. "The question is, what does it want?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the whispering grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of indistinct voices. It felt like the walls were closing in, and the cold was deeper now, reaching into their bones. Jack could feel the unease settling in like a weight in his chest, and he knew, even without looking at the others, that they all sensed it too. Whatever was here, it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The air thickened with each step, the darkness pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the dimness or the stale smell of the old building that unsettled the team now. The atmosphere had shifted. The air hummed with a low, vibrating frequency, like a tension building inside a storm. Then the hallway flickered, and the present dissolved into the past. The walls straightened, the tiles gleamed under clean white lights, and the air smelled of antiseptic. The sounds of distant voices, whispers, and faint sobbing filled the hall. The hallway seemed to stretch and twist before their eyes, splitting into multiple corridors, each lined with doors that hadn't been there moments before. "We're not in the present anymore," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're seeing what it was like here decades ago." Before anyone could respond, the team was pulled apart by the shifting corridors, each member tumbling into different sequences of memories. The present-day asylum dissolved entirely, replaced by vivid, shifting scenes from its past. Clara's visions. Clara found herself in a brightly lit room lined with metal doors. The air was damp and cool, with the faint scent of bleach. As she walked down the hallway, she could hear muffled cries coming from behind the doors. She paused at one of them, drawn to the desperate whispers emanating from the other side. When she peeked through the small square window, she saw her own reflection staring back at her. But the reflection wasn't her as she was now. It was a younger version, pale and emaciated, wearing a hospital gown. The door creaked open slowly, as if inviting her in. When she stepped inside, the room transformed, and she was no longer an observer. She was strapped to a cold metal gurney, her arms and legs restrained. Her skin prickled with the sensation of tiny needles pressing into her flesh, though she couldn't see any instruments. A nurse leaned over her, holding a syringe filled with a murky, greenish liquid. "This will help calm you down," he murmured, and despite her struggles, he injected the fluid into her arm. Immediately, her vision blurred, and a wave of numbness spread through her body. The nurse's face seemed to change, shifting between different people she had never seen before. Then, the room dissolved, pulling her back into the hallway. The hallway flickered again, and Clara was now in a common room filled with patients. They sat in stiff chairs, their heads drooped and their limbs slack. She felt herself drawn to an elderly woman with hollow eyes who rocked back and forth, muttering under her breath. When Clara reached out to touch her, she felt a shock of cold as the woman's skin crumbled beneath her fingers like dried clay. Suddenly, she was sitting in one of the chairs herself, and her own limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. She tried to lift her hand, but it was as if she was wading through molasses. A deep, paralyzing fear settled in her chest as she realized she could no longer move of her own will. She was part of the memory, trapped within its suffocating embrace. The common room faded, and Clara found herself standing in the present-day hallway again, gasping for air. Ethan's visions. Ethan stumbled into a surgical theater, the room bright and sterile. He was strapped to an operating table, unable to move. The faint beeping of machinery echoed around him, and shadowy figures wearing surgical masks circled him like vultures. His chest tightened with terror as he realized he couldn't control his breathing. It was shallow and ragged, as if someone else was dictating the rise and fall of his chest. A doctor's voice rang out, "This will help you see things clearly." A hand appeared above him, holding a scalpel that gleamed under the bright light. Ethan braced himself for pain, but when the scalpel touched his skin, it felt more like an icy burn spreading across his chest. The world swirled, and suddenly he was in another room, surrounded by the same doctors. But now they were crowding around him, whispering strange words, their faces growing distorted, their eyes unnaturally wide. Their whispers grew louder until it felt like they were screaming inside his head. The world around Ethan snapped back to the present, but only for a moment. He stumbled into a different vision, finding himself inside a padded cell. The walls were lined with thick cushions, and he could hear the sound of someone, himself, muttering repeatedly, "It's not real, it's not real." His voice echoed back at him, disembodied, yet originating from his own throat. The padded walls began to close in, pressing against him, suffocating him. He thrashed and clawed at the walls, desperately trying to find an escape. Just as he was about to be crushed, the room dissolved, and he fell forward into the present-day hallway, his skin clammy and cold. Sophie's visions. Sophie was standing in a dimly lit room filled with cabinets and shelves cluttered with bottles of pills and vials of unknown fluids. The labels were all written in an indecipherable scrawl. She reached out to pick up one of the bottles, but her hand passed right through it, like mist. The room seemed to grow darker, and Sophie felt herself shrinking, as though the space was expanding around her. The bottles and shelves loomed larger, and as she tried to back away, she bumped into a patient standing behind her, herself. Her own face stared back at her, vacant and drained of color. The other Sophie opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only a silent scream. The room shifted, and Sophie was now in a line of patients being led down a narrow corridor by a pair of orderlies. The other patients shuffled forward with dazed expressions, their feet dragging against the floor. Sophie tried to break away from the line, but her feet felt glued to the ground. As they rounded a corner, the corridor opened into a large room with bright overhead lights and a dozen gurneys lined up in neat rows. She was strapped down on one of the gurneys in an instant. An orderly leaned over her, and she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had been in this exact situation countless times before. The orderly whispered something into her ear that she couldn't understand, and a sense of dread washed over her as everything went black. Harris's visions. Harris was in the records room, but it was different this time. The file cabinets loomed over him, stretching up to the ceiling which seemed impossibly far above. He rifled through the files, his fingers moving faster than his mind could process. He read patients' names and diagnoses, and with each file, he felt like he was reading about himself. The symptoms listed, paranoia, hallucinations, loss of identity, echoed in his own thoughts, making him question if the records were describing him. As he pulled out another file, the room began to spin, and the walls closed in. He felt like he was trapped, and his skull was about to split open. The records room shifted, and Harris found himself standing in a large, empty ward. Beds were lined up on either side, each occupied by a patient covered with thin, white sheets. The patients lay motionless, their faces hidden, but Harris could hear their breathing, steady and synchronized. He walked slowly down the row of beds, feeling an inexplicable urge to pull back one of the sheets. When he did, he found himself staring down at his own lifeless face, his eyes wide open but unseeing. He stumbled back, tripping over a bed frame as the room dissolved, and he returned to the present-day asylum. Jack's visions. Jack was no longer himself. He was Dr. Harlan, dressed in a white coat, standing over a restrained patient in a treatment room. The patient thrashed against the gurney, pleading for mercy, but Jack's hands moved without hesitation, picking up a syringe filled with a cloudy fluid. There was a coldness inside him, a detachment that wasn't his own, yet he felt it as if it were a part of him. "This is for your own good," he heard himself say as he injected the fluid into the patient's arm. The patient's screams filled the room, their voice cracking with despair, but Jack felt only a sense of duty and necessity, as if what he was doing was right. The scene shifted, and Jack was in an office, sitting behind a large wooden desk. Medical files lay spread out in front of him, each one detailing a different patient's treatment. As he read the notes, he felt his emotions drain away, replaced by a cold logic that told him this was all necessary work. He stood up and approached a cabinet filled with jars of preserved specimens, pieces of brains, spinal cords, organs that had been extracted for study. Jack felt a sickening chill run down his spine, yet there was a part of him that couldn't deny the fascination that accompanied the horror. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a sense of pride, as if he had achieved something significant. The sensation wasn't his own, but it gripped him with an intensity that made him question where his thoughts ended and the doctor's began. The office around him blurred, and the walls shifted back into the hallway. Jack gasped as he came to, his hand still hovering in front of him as if holding an invisible syringe. The phantom sensation of gripping cold steel lingered on his fingertips. He stumbled backward, struggling to ground himself in the present. The disorientation was overwhelming, and the guilt clung to him like a heavy fog, as though the doctor's actions had stained his soul. The visions continued to shift and bleed into one another. Each time the team thought they had returned to the present, the scenes would morph again, pulling them deeper into the asylum's past. The corridors became a chaotic blend of both the present-day decay and the pristine, eerie cleanliness of the asylum's earlier years. It was as if time itself had fractured, trapping them in a labyrinth where the past refused to stay buried. The cries of the patients echoed down the hallways, growing louder and more frantic. Shadowy figures appeared in the periphery of their vision, flickering like faulty projections, sometimes reaching out as if to pull the team back into the memories. The lines between observer and participant blurred, and each of them felt as though they were being drawn into the patient's suffering, reliving the experiences over and over. Clara's voice cut through the chaos, her tone trembling but forceful. "We need to get out of here," she shouted, though it felt as if the walls swallowed her words almost immediately. She could sense the asylum's energy warping around them, as though it were trying to keep them inside its memories, feeding off their fear. Her intuition led her to believe that the visions were not random, they were meant to hold the team captive, just like the patients had been. Desperate, Clara focused on a faint energy trail that seemed to guide her towards the exit, though it flickered in and out of existence. "Follow my voice," she called again, pushing herself to move forward, despite the heavy, dragging sensation pulling at her limbs. One by one, the others emerged from the fractured memories, appearing in the present-day corridors, as if they had clawed their way back from a nightmare. Each of them looked disoriented, haunted by the experiences they had lived through. Ethan was pale and shaking, his eyes darting around as if expecting to be pulled back into the surgical theater at any moment. "That wasn't just a hallucination," he said breathlessly. "I felt everything. It was too real." "I know," Sophie murmured, her voice hoarse. She clutched at her arms as if trying to ground herself. "I could feel myself slipping, like I was part of that memory." Harris glanced at the walls, which still seemed to shimmer slightly, as though not fully settled back into the present. "It's like the asylum's trying to merge us with its past," he said, his expression grim. "We need to move before it happens again." With Clara in the lead, the group moved through the flickering corridors, which continued to alternate between the decayed present and the reconstructed past. The sense of urgency grew with each step, as if the walls themselves were closing in, trying to push them back into the depths of the asylum's consciousness. As they approached the entrance hall, the floor beneath them seemed to shift, momentarily turning into polished tile before reverting back to cracked linoleum. The double doors loomed ahead, faintly illuminated, wavering like a mirage in the dark. It felt like reaching the surface after being submerged in deep water. Their lungs burned, and their hearts pounded as they pushed toward the exit. Just as they neared the doors, the air around them thickened once more, and for a moment, the vision returned. Jack was suddenly back in the treatment room, staring down at a restrained patient. Only this time, the patient was himself. His own eyes met his from the gurney, filled with a pleading terror that sent a shock of recognition through him. "No," he muttered, forcing himself to break free from the vision. He stumbled forward, grabbed the door handle, and yanked it open with all his strength. The team spilled out onto the front lawn, gasping for breath as the cold night air hit their faces. The oppressive weight that had clung to them inside the building finally began to lift. They looked back at the asylum, which now loomed in eerie silence, its windows dark and still. But the lingering feeling of the visions clung to each of them, a faint but unshakable presence in the back of their minds. It was as though the memories hadn't fully released their grip, and a part of them remained in the asylum, as much a part of its history as the patients themselves. The echo wasn't just the lingering spirits of the dead, it was the accumulation of all the suffering that had taken place within those walls. And now, each of them had experienced a piece of that suffering, as if the asylum itself had momentarily claimed them. As they walked to the van, each team member carried the weight of their experiences in a different way. They had escaped the building, but it was uncertain whether they had truly escaped the darkness that had dwelled there for so long. As the leader, Jack tries to collect himself. The night air slapped me awake the moment we burst out of Elwood Asylum, but the relief was short-lived. I sucked in deep breaths, but it felt like the darkness inside had followed us out, weighing down the air in my lungs. We staggered onto the damp grass, our movements clumsy and exhausted. I slumped against a crumbling stone pillar and forced myself to look back at the asylum. It loomed there in the dark, its windows like hollow eyes watching us, as if mocking our desperate escape. My hand wouldn't stop shaking. I could still feel it, the sensation of standing over that gurney, looking down at my own terrified face. The memory clung to me like a sickness, and no matter how many times I clenched my fists or took deep breaths, the guilt and helplessness wouldn't go away. We're out, right?" Ethan's voice was small, almost childlike. He rubbed his arms, glancing back at the asylum with wide, haunted eyes. "Tell me we're actually out." Clara spoke up, but even she didn't sound sure. "We're out," she said, her voice carrying more of a question than a statement. "But it doesn't feel like we're free." I didn't need her to elaborate. We'd all felt it, that suffocating grip that still seemed to cling to our skin, even out here in the open air. As I looked at each of them, I saw different shades of fear and exhaustion, as if a piece of that place had worked its way inside each of us. I tried to clear my head, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the visions. They weren't just memories. It felt like we had been pulled into a living, breathing thing that refused to let go. I wasn't the only one still struggling. It was clear in the way the others carried themselves, the haunted looks in their eyes, the way they kept glancing over their shoulders. Clara's haunted expression. I watched her as she stood off to the side, rubbing her temples like she was trying to push out some invisible presence. She kept tilting her head, her eyes narrowing as though she were listening to something that wasn't there. "The voices? They're still there," she whispered when she caught my eye. "It's like they're just out of reach, but I can still hear them." Ethan's tension. Ethan was rubbing the back of his head, a pained expression on his face. "I can still feel it," he said quietly. Where they did it." He didn't need to say more. The memory of that surgical theater was etched across his features. He kept glancing back at the asylum, as if expecting someone, or something, to come after him. Sophie's disorientation. Sophie was huddled close to the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees. She kept rubbing her arms, trying to bring some warmth back to her skin. "I feel like I'm still there," she whispered. "Like I'm still stuck in that room. I can't shake it." Her voice trembled, and there was a distant look in her eyes like she was caught between here and somewhere else. Harris's confusion. Harris kept pacing in circles, his movements jerky and unsettled. It's all jumbled up, he muttered. Like I'm still hearing voices, but I don't know what they're saying. He paused and looked up at the asylum, his face pale and drawn. It's like we're not really out. I felt it too. The asylum wasn't just a building, it was alive, and it didn't want to let us go. It had tried to swallow us whole, to keep us trapped in those fractured memories. Even now, standing outside, it felt like its dark influence was still curling around us, reaching out from the depths of its twisted consciousness. It was trying to keep us there, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears, to trap us in its memories. Clara turned her haunted gaze toward me. It wasn't just trying to show us the past, she said, her voice quiet and steady. It was merging us with it. Like we weren't just seeing those memories, we were becoming part of them. The thought sent a chill down my spine. The idea that we'd come so close to losing ourselves, to being consumed by that place. It was more than I could bear. I pushed myself away from the pillar and glanced at the others. We needed to get away from here, to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that building. As we began to move toward the van, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, almost as if they were trying to reach out and pull us back. I kept my eyes on the ground, but I could feel that weight, that dark pressure pressing in at the edges of my mind. We weren't alone. Even out here, I could feel it watching us. Wait, Clara said, her voice urgent, as she pulled out a bundle of sage from her bag. We can't leave like this. If there's any part of that place still clinging to us. I knew she was right. I could feel it too, like a black tar that had settled into my chest. We gathered around her as she lit the sage and began to wave it around us in slow, careful circles. The scent filled the air, mingling with the night breeze, and for a moment the weight lifted. The shadows seemed to retreat, as though unsure whether to let us go. Let's go, Sophie said, her voice thin and strained. I don't want to stay here any longer. We climbed into the van, slamming the doors behind us as if that could keep the darkness out. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine rumbled to life. But even the familiar sound didn't chase away the silence that had settled between us. It was like we'd left a part of ourselves back in that building. Like the asylum had taken a piece of each of us as a souvenir. I focused on the road as we pulled away, but my hands tightened on the wheel when I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a figure in one of the upper windows, just a faint outline, standing motionless, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I didn't say anything, but when I glanced at Ethan, I saw the same haunted look on his face that I felt tightening in my chest. Whatever had happened inside, whatever had followed us out, wasn't going to let go so easily. As the asylum faded into the distance, the night stretched out before us. A long, dark road leading away from that place. But even as the building disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped, that we were still carrying something with us. It was like a shadow in the back of my mind, a voice whispering just out of reach. We'd left the building behind, but part of me knew it hadn't left us. The drive back was a blur, the road stretching endlessly before us as the night swallowed up the last glimpses of Elwood Asylum. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, trying to focus on the steady hum of the van's engine. Anything to push away the feeling that still clung to me like a second skin. I could hear the others shifting restlessly in their seats, but no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, filled with the weight of everything we'd just been through. When we finally pulled into the lot outside the office, it felt like a lifetime had passed since we'd set out. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, no one moved. It was as if none of us were quite ready to step out of the safety of the van and confront whatever we had brought back with us. Let's just get this over with, I said, breaking the silence. We need to review the footage, see if we actually caught anything, or if it was just all in our heads. Inside the office, the air was cold and still, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I set up the equipment. We gathered around the monitor, the tension palpable, as I connected the hard drives and began to pull up the recordings. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Part of me dreaded the idea that we'd captured nothing at all, that our experiences had been nothing more than a collective hallucination. But the other part of me feared something far worse. That the footage would confirm that what we saw, what we felt, had been all too real. I pressed play on the first video, and the screen flickered to life. The images of the asylum's corridors appeared on the monitor, the grainy footage capturing the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. At first, it was just the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls, our voices hushed as we made our way through the halls. And then, there it was, a faint flicker, like a shadow moving at the edge of the frame. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. The camera had picked up something. I paused the video and rewound it, frame by frame. The shape wasn't distinct, more of a distortion in the air than a figure, but it moved against the grain of the static, almost like it was drifting closer. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "It looks like something's trying to take form." "It's hard to say," I replied, though a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. "Let's keep going." We moved to the next recording, and this time there was more. The camera, set up near one of the patient wards, had captured a faint whisper. "Help me," followed by a low, distorted hum that grew louder and louder, until it felt like it was vibrating right through the speakers. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I recognized the voice. It was Sophie's. But she hadn't said anything like that while we were inside, had she? Sophie's face went pale as she stared at the screen. I don't remember saying that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But it sounds like me." As we continued reviewing the footage, more anomalies appeared. At times, the video seemed to glitch, the frames warping to reveal brief glimpses of things we hadn't seen with our own eyes. Patients strapped to gurneys, shadowy figures pacing the halls, faces that seemed to appear and disappear in the walls. Each time the images shifted, it was as if the camera had momentarily been sucked back into the past, capturing fragments of the asylum's memories. In one clip, there was a particularly unsettling moment. The camera, pointed toward the entrance of the treatment wing, showed a figure standing just beyond the doorway. It was difficult to make out any features, but it was tall and motionless, watching. I rewound the footage and played it again. The figure was gone. The doorway was empty. "I saw that," Clara said quietly. "I saw something there." Her voice cracked, and she rubbed her arms as if trying to shake off the lingering chill. "Replay it," I said, my voice steady despite the anxiety building inside me. I rewound the clip again, and this time, as I paused it on the exact frame, a face seemed to emerge from the shadows, a faint, blurred image that was almost indistinguishable from the background. But it was there, and as I stared at it, I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was me. The hours bled away as we reviewed the footage, each new anomaly deepening the sense of dread that had settled over us. We had gone in to document the paranormal, to separate fact from fiction. But as we pored over the recordings, it became increasingly clear that we had done more than that. We had walked straight into the asylum's memories, and those memories hadn't stayed confined to the walls. We shut down the equipment, the silence returning like a heavy blanket. I could feel the others' eyes on me, waiting for me to say something, to make sense of what we'd seen. But there were no explanations that would satisfy any of us. No way to frame the experience that didn't sound like madness. "We need to be careful," I finally said, breaking the silence. "We might have left that place behind, but it hasn't let us go. There's a part of it still with us, and I don't know if we'll ever be free of it." Clara nodded, her expression distant. "It's like a stain," she murmured. "A darkness that follows you, no matter where you go." I couldn't argue with that. It did feel like a stain. Something that had seeped into our skin, our minds, a residue of the asylum's torment that refused to wash away. The footage was just a confirmation of what we already knew deep down. We hadn't left Elwood Asylum. Not really. Some part of us was still trapped there, just like the patients had been. As we prepared to leave the office, I took one last glance at the monitor. The screen was dark, the video player closed, but I could have sworn I saw a flicker, a faint, barely perceptible shift in the darkness. I stood there, staring at the blank screen, my pulse quickening as I waited for something else to appear. But nothing did. I turned away and followed the others out, locking the door behind us. The night air was crisp and cold, but it did little to chase away the feeling that clung to me. The silence outside was different now. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an expectation, a waiting. As we walked to our cars, I glanced up at the sky. The stars seemed dull, distant. I wondered if we'd really escaped, or if the asylum had somehow reached inside us, twisted something loose that couldn't be put back. I climbed into my car and turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. I drove away, the road stretching out ahead of me, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed, like a shadow that trailed just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to catch up. We had escaped Elwood Asylum, but some doors, once opened, never truly close.